There's nothing that cuts deeper than losing a child, and nothing that haunts a father's heart quite like 20 years of unanswered questions. Every parent's worst nightmare had become Elijah Rourke's daily reality, when his 8-year-old daughter Sarah vanished without a trace from their mountain home. For 2 decades, this old mountain man lived alone in the Wyoming wilderness, building his cabin with hands that shook from grief and memories that wouldn't let him sleep. He'd searched every trail, followed every lead, and questioned every stranger who passed through. Nothing. Sarah had simply disappeared like morning mist. Then one frozen morning, a dying wolf crawled into his clearing. The beast was bleeding, barely breathing, but around its neck was something impossible. A small red ribbon, faded by time but unmistakable. It was exactly like the one Sarah wore the day she disappeared. How does a wild animal carry a father's most precious memory across 20 years of mountain wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered sentinel against the mountain's face, its logs darkened by decades of snow and summer storms. Elijah Rourke had built it with his own hands 23 years ago, back when hope still lived in his chest and laughter echoed through these rooms. Now the structure stood as much a prison as a home, every board and beam a reminder of what once was. On his mantel, gathering dust in the weak morning light, sat a hand-carved wooden horse. Its mane was painted yellow, Sarah's favorite color, and one ear had been worn smooth by countless small fingers. He'd whittled it from pine during the winter she turned 7, working by candlelight while she slept, planning to surprise her come Christmas morning. She'd named it Thunder and carried it everywhere until that terrible day when both girl and toy were found abandoned by the creek. The horse was all he had left of her now. Martha had taken everything else when she fled down the mountain 6 months after Sarah's disappearance. She couldn't bear the silence, she'd said, couldn't stand the way Elijah stared at empty doorways and set 3 places at the table out of habit. "You're living with ghosts," she'd accused him on that final morning, her bags already packed. "And I can't watch you die slowly anymore." She'd been right, of course. He was dying slowly, had been for 20 years now. Each sunrise brought another day of the same questions, the same hollow ache where his heart used to be. Where was his little girl? What had happened to her in those woods? Had she suffered? Did she call for him as whatever darkness took her closed in? The questions had carved grooves in his mind deeper than any mountain stream had ever cut through stone. His morning routine never varied. Rise before dawn, stoke the fire, brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Check the traps he no longer needed for survival. Habit died harder than hope, it seemed. Then he'd walk the perimeter of his property, eyes scanning for any sign, any clue that might have emerged in the night. 20 years of walking the same paths had worn them smooth as glass. The mountains knew him now. Bears gave him a wide berth, recognizing something in his scent that marked him as neither threat nor prey, but something else entirely. A creature touched by loss so profound it had become its own species of dangerous. Elk would graze peacefully in his presence, and even the mountain lions showed him a grudging respect, sensing perhaps that they hunted different prey. He'd been a different man once. Before Sarah, before the cabin, before the silence became his closest companion. Elijah Rourke had been one of the finest trackers in 3 states, a man who could read sign like other men read newspapers. He'd guided hunting parties for wealthy folks from back east, led search and rescue missions when hikers went missing. And once, just once, he'd helped the territorial marshal track down a killer who'd fled into these same mountains. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could find anyone or anything that left a trail, except the one person who mattered most. He'd studied every broken twig within 10 miles of where Sarah's ribbon and wooden horse were found by the creek. He'd followed tracks that led to nowhere, pursued leads that crumbled like autumn leaves, and questioned every trapper, prospector, and drifter who passed through these parts. Nothing. She'd vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. The territorial authorities had given up after 2 months. Sometimes folks just disappear in country like this, the marshal had said, avoiding Elijah's eyes. It could have been a bear, a fall, anything. These mountains don't give up their secrets easy, but Elijah knew better. Bears left sign. Falls left bodies. Zara's disappearance was different. Too clean, too complete. Someone had taken her, and whoever it was knew these mountains almost as well as he did. The wolf appeared on a Tuesday morning in late November, emerging from the tree line like something out of a fever dream. Elijah had been splitting wood behind the cabin when movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a deer, the way it moved slow and careful through the snow. But then he saw the dark fur, the distinctive pointed ears, and his hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against the wood pile. Wolves were rare in these parts now, hunted nearly to extinction by ranchers and settlers who saw them as nothing but trouble. This one was clearly in bad shape, its coat matted with blood and ice, its gait unsteady. As it drew closer, Elijah could see deep gashes along its flanks and a front paw that didn't quite touch the ground right. The animal stopped maybe 30 feet from where he stood, its yellow eyes meeting his with an intelligence that sent a chill up his spine. Most wild creatures, especially injured ones, would flee at the sight of a human. This wolf just stood there watching him with what almost looked like recognition. "Easy now," Elijah murmured, setting down his axe slowly. "You're hurt pretty bad, aren't you, old fellow?" The wolf took another step forward, then another, its breathing labored and painful to watch. There was something desperate in its movements, something that spoke of a need greater than fear or self-preservation. When it finally collapsed at the edge of his clearing, Elijah could see just how badly injured it really was. 3 long gashes ran along its right side, probably from a bear's claws. Its left front paw was swollen and bent at an odd angle. But it was the wolf's eyes that held him, not wild and feral as he'd expected, but filled with something that looked almost like pleading against his better judgment. Elijah approached slowly, hands visible and empty. 20 years of mountain living had taught him to read animals as well as he read human sign, and this wolf wasn't looking for a fight. It was looking for help. As he knelt beside the injured creature, that's when he saw it. Tied around the wolf's thick neck with what looked like leather cord was a small piece of fabric. Red fabric, faded and weathered but unmistakably red, tied in a simple bow that his heart recognized even before his mind could process what he was seeing. Sarah's ribbon. The same red ribbon she'd worn in her hair the morning she disappeared. The same ribbon that had been found tangled in creek brush 20 years ago, torn and muddy but whole. He'd kept it pressed between the pages of his Bible, the only proof that his daughter had ever existed beyond his memories. But this ribbon was different. Similar, yes, the same color, the same width, even tied in the same simple bow that Martha had taught Sarah to make. But this one was older, more weathered, as if it had been exposed to decades of mountain weather. The wolf's breathing was growing shallower, its eyes beginning to dim, but it never looked away from Elijah's face. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought long buried. "Where did you come from, boy?" The wolf's tail thumped once against the snow, weak but deliberate. Its muzzle was graying with age, Elijah realized. This wasn't a young animal. If he had to guess, he'd say the creature was at least 15 years old, maybe older. Old for a wolf in the wild. With trembling fingers he reached for the ribbon. The wolf didn't resist as he untied the leather cord, didn't snap or growl as Elijah lifted the faded fabric to the light. Up close, he could see tiny differences, a slightly different weave, a shade of red that was close but not quite right. But the bow, the way it was tied, the careful precision of the knots, that was pure Sarah. The wolf's breathing stopped just as the first snowflakes began to fall. Elijah sat there in the gathering storm, cradling the head of a creature that had carried impossible memories across impossible years. The ribbon lay in his palm like a question mark made of cloth, and for the first time in 2 decades, he felt something stirring in his chest that might have been hope, but hope was a dangerous thing in these mountains. Hope had led him down false trails before, had whispered lies about strangers who might have seen something, footprints that might mean something. Hope had been his enemy longer than loneliness ever was. Still, as he looked down at the wolf's peaceful face and the ribbon in his palm, Elijah Rourke felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness that had swallowed his daughter, someone knew something. Someone had tied this ribbon. Someone had known Sarah well enough to learn her special way of making bows. Someone was still alive who remembered his little girl. The question was whether that someone was friend or foe, and whether an old man's heart could survive learning the truth after 20 years of carefully constructed lies. Elijah buried the wolf behind his cabin as the snow began to fall in earnest. The ground was frozen hard, requiring him to build a fire over the earth just to soften it enough for digging. As he worked, the red ribbon lay on his kitchen table like an accusation. Impossible to ignore, yet equally impossible to explain. By the time he'd finished laying the stones over the grave, night had fallen and the storm had settled into the steady, determined rhythm that meant it would last for days. He sat at his table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at the ribbon under the flickering light of his oil lamp. 20 years of questions flooded back with renewed force. He'd memorized every detail of that terrible morning. How Sarah had insisted on wearing her red ribbon because it matched her new winter coat. How she'd practiced tying the bow 3 times before getting it right. How she'd skipped ahead of him on the path to their fishing spot, singing some little song she'd made up about mountain flowers. They'd been heading to Willow Creek, barely a mile from the cabin, where Sarah liked to look for smooth stones while he checked his fish traps. She'd run ahead despite his calls to stay close, disappearing around a bend in the trail with her wooden horse clutched in her small fist. When he'd rounded the same bend, not 30 seconds later, she was gone. He'd found the ribbon and the horse by the creek bank 20 minutes later, both muddy and torn as if dropped in haste. But there had been no other sign, no footprints save his own and Sarah's, no broken branches, no scrap of clothing. It was as if she'd simply vanished into thin air. Now, looking at this second ribbon, older and more weathered, but tied in exactly the same way, Elijah felt his carefully constructed world beginning to tilt. Someone out there knew how Sarah tied her bows. Someone had kept her memory alive in fabric and leather cord, carrying it through the wilderness on the neck of an ancient wolf. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams of yellow-haired girls running through snow-covered forests and wolves with human eyes. When morning light finally filtered through his frost-covered windows, Elijah knew what he had to do. For 20 years he'd waited for answers to come to him. Now perhaps it was time to go looking for them. The storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow and a world transformed into crystalline silence. Elijah strapped on his snowshoes and checked his pack: dried meat, coffee, matches, ammunition, and the canvas bedroll he hadn't used in 15 years. He wrapped the ribbon carefully in oiled cloth and tucked it close to his heart. He would follow the wolf's trail backward, track it to wherever it had come from. Even with the fresh snow, there might be sign. Disturbed earth where the creature had rested, claw marks on trees, the distinctive scent that wolves left behind to mark their territory. Elijah had tracked wounded animals before. They followed predictable patterns, seeking shelter near water, favoring certain types of terrain. But as he began following the faint depression in the snow where the wolf had first appeared, Elijah realized this wouldn't be like any tracking job he'd ever undertaken. The wolf had come from the north, toward the deep wilderness, where few men had ever set foot. It was country so remote and rugged that even the indigenous tribes had used it only for vision, quests and spiritual ceremonies. The trail led him up through stands of lodgepole pine and across frozen meadows where his snowshoes sank deep despite the hard-packed surface beneath. Every few hundred yards he stopped to study the faint signs. A tuft of dark fur caught on bark, a place where the wolf had paused to rest, the yellow stain where it had marked its passage. By midday, he'd climbed nearly 2,000 feet, and the trail was beginning to tell a story. The wolf hadn't been wandering aimlessly. Despite its injuries, it had been moving with purpose, following game trails and natural corridors through the forest with the confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. More troubling was the realization that this wolf had been traveling for days, possibly weeks. The scattered signs suggested a creature that had been wounded somewhere far to the north and had made the slow, painful journey toward Elijah's cabin with deliberate intent. But that was impossible. Wild animals didn't seek out specific humans for help, especially not across dozens of miles of wilderness. As the afternoon light began to fade, Elijah found the first real clue. In a sheltered grove, where the wolf had clearly rested for some time, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the bark of an ancient pine, at wolf height, were 3 simple marks, 2 vertical lines crossed by a single horizontal slash. He knew that symbol. Every mountain man and trapper in the territory knew it. It was the mark of Jonas Grimm, a hermit who disappeared into these mountains more than 30 years ago after some trouble with the law back east. Grimm had been legendary, even among men who prided themselves on their ability to survive in the wilderness. A man who could live off the land indefinitely, who knew every trail and hidden valley from here to Canada. But Jonas Grimm would be in his 70s now, if he was still alive at all. Most folks assumed he'd died long ago, claimed by the same mountains that had given him refuge. The territorial authorities had stopped looking for him after the first few years, figuring the wilderness had delivered its own justice. What was a symbol associated with Grimm doing on a tree along the path of a wolf that had carried Sarah's ribbon to his door? Elijah studied the carving more closely in the fading light. The cuts were old but not ancient. Made within the last 5 years, he guessed, based on how the bark had grown around the edges. Someone was still alive up here, still moving through this country and marking their passage. As darkness approached, he made camp in the same grove where the wolf had rested. He built a small fire and heated some coffee, his mind racing with possibilities he hardly dared consider. If Jonas Grimm was still alive somewhere in these mountains, if he'd had contact with the wolf, if he knew something about Sarah's disappearance, it opened doors to questions Elijah had thought were sealed forever. But it also opened darker possibilities. Grimm had fled into the wilderness to escape justice for reasons no one talked about openly. What kind of man could survive alone in this country for 3 decades? What kind of secrets might such a man be keeping? The fire crackled and popped as Elijah stared up at the star-filled sky, the red ribbon still pressed against his chest. Tomorrow he would continue following the trail, push deeper into country where no decent man belonged. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, he felt something besides despair when he thought about his daughter. Whether that something was hope or terror, he couldn't yet say. Dawn broke grey and bitter over the high country, bringing with it a wind that cut through Elijah's woolen coat like it was made of paper. He'd slept poorly, haunted by dreams of carved symbols and yellow eyes, and his joints complained loudly as he broke camp. 63 years of mountain living had taken their toll, but determination had a way of making old bones feel young again. The wolf's trail continued north, leading him through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous with each passing mile. Ancient rock slides had carved scars across the mountainsides, and more than once Elijah found himself picking his way across loose stone that shifted ominously under his snowshoes. This was country that tested even experienced mountaineers, yet the wolf had navigated it with the confidence of long familiarity. 3 hours into the morning's trek, he found the second marker, another pine tree bearing Jonas Grimm's distinctive symbol, this one carved deeper and more recently than the first. But there was something else here that made Elijah's pulse quicken. Hanging from a low branch, protected from the weather by an overhang of stone, was a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a piece of paper covered in cramped handwriting. The ink was faded but legible, and Elijah's hands trembled as he read the words, "If you're following the wolf's trail, you're closer than you know." But closer to what, you might ask? That depends on how much truth an old father's heart can bear. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The cabin with the blue door sits where three streams meet. Come alone or don't come at all. A friend to the lost, Elijah read the note 3 times before the words fully sank in. Someone had been expecting him. Someone knew he would follow the wolf's trail north into this godforsaken wilderness. Someone knew about Sarah, about his 20-year search, about the depth of a father's desperate love. But who? And how? The blue door mentioned in the note sparked a memory from his early days in the territory. Old-timers used to speak of a cabin deep in the mountains, built by some hermit who painted his door blue to ward off evil spirits. Most folks dismissed it as legend, just another tall tale told around winter fires. But if the note was to be believed, the cabin was real and hidden where 3 streams converged. Elijah studied the terrain ahead with new purpose. He was already following one creek that tumbled down from the high peaks in a series of frozen waterfalls. If he was reading the geography correctly, there should be 2 more streams joining this one somewhere in the valley beyond the next ridge. The climb up to the ridge took most of the afternoon. His snowshoes found purchase on the steep slope, but progress was slow and exhausting. Twice he had to stop and rest, his breathing coming in sharp puffs that crystallized instantly in the thin air. He was no longer the young man who had once guided hunting parties across these same mountains with ease, but as he crested the ridge and looked down into the valley beyond, his fatigue vanished. There, nestled in a grove of aspens where 3 streams indeed came together, stood a small log cabin. And even from this distance, he could see that its door was painted a distinctive shade of blue. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney in a thin, steady line, indicating recent habitation. Someone was home waiting for him. The thought sent equal measures of anticipation and dread coursing through his veins. The descent into the valley was treacherous in the fading light. But Elijah moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life navigating difficult terrain. As he drew closer to the cabin, more details became visible. The structure was old but well maintained, its logs chinked tight against the winter cold. A small corral held 2 horses, both looking well fed and cared for. This wasn't the rough shelter of a desperate fugitive. It was the home of someone who had chosen isolation rather than had it forced upon them. 50 yards from the blue door, Elijah stopped and called out in the traditional mountain greeting, "Hello, the house." The door opened immediately, as if someone had been watching his approach. The figure that emerged was tall and gaunt, with hair gone white and a beard that reached nearly to his chest. His clothes were rough-sewn leather and wool, practical garments that spoke of years spent far from civilization. But it was the man's eyes that held Elijah's attention, pale blue and sharp with intelligence, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and remembered all of it. "You came," the man said, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone who rarely spoke aloud. "I wasn't certain you would." "You know me," Elijah replied. "It wasn't a question. I know of you. Elijah Rourke, mountain man, tracker, father to a little girl who vanished 20 years ago. You've been searching for her ever since, haven't you?" The casual mention of Sarah hit Elijah like a physical blow. Who are you?" The old man stepped aside and gestured toward the open door. "My name is Jonas Grimm, and I believe it's time we had a long overdue conversation about your daughter." The interior of the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and the walls were lined with shelves holding books, tools, and various items that spoke of a life lived in careful solitude. But what drew Elijah's attention immediately was the mantelpiece above the fire. There, arranged with obvious care, were a dozen items he didn't recognize at first glance. But as his eyes adjusted to the lamplight, he began to make out details that turned his blood to ice. A child's hair ribbon, not red this time, but yellow. A small carved wooden bird. A tiny moccasin sized for a small foot. A piece of blue fabric that might once have been part of a dress. "My God," he whispered. "What is this place?" Jonas Grimm closed the door behind them and moved to stand beside the fireplace. In the flickering light, his weathered face looked ancient and infinitely sad. "This," he said quietly, "is where I keep the memories of the lost children. All the little ones who disappeared into these mountains over the years. All the ones whose fathers never stopped searching, whose mothers never stopped hoping." Elijah's legs gave out, and he collapsed into a rough wooden chair. "How many?" 17 in 31 years. All taken from their families, all brought here to the deep mountains where no one would think to look. All of them precious to someone. The room seemed to spin around Elijah as the implications sank in. Taken by whom? Jonas Grimm met his eyes with a gaze that held depths of sorrow Elijah had never seen in another human being. "By me, Mr. Rourke. They were all taken by me." The silence that followed Jonas Grimm's confession stretched between them like a chasm. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife at his belt, 20 years of suppressed rage beginning to boil in his chest. This man, this monster, had admitted to taking children, had admitted to taking Sarah. "Easy now," Jonas said, raising his weathered hands in a gesture of peace. "I can see the murder in your eyes, and I don't blame you for it. But before you do something you might regret, let me tell you the whole truth. The real truth, not the simple one that fits your anger. The truth." Elijah's voice came out as a growl. "You just confessed to kidnapping children. What other truth could there be?" Jonas moved slowly to a wooden trunk in the corner of the cabin, his movements careful and deliberate. "The truth is more complicated than that, friend. Always is, in these mountains." He opened the trunk and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. "Tell me, Mr. Rourke, what do you know about the Blackwood Trading Company?" The name hit Elijah like a slap. Everyone in the territory knew about Blackwood, a powerful outfit that controlled most of the fur trade from here to Canada. They had posts scattered throughout the wilderness, and enough money and influence to make problems disappear. But what did they have to do with missing children? "I know they're rich and ruthless," Elijah replied, his hand still on his knife. "I know they don't let anything stand in the way of profit. Rich, yes. Ruthless, absolutely." Jonas unwrapped the leather bundle, revealing a thick ledger bound in black cloth. "But what you don't know is that they supplement their fur income with a different kind of trade. A trade in something much more valuable than beaver pelts." He opened the ledger and turned it so Elijah could see the pages. Written in neat columns were names, dates, and amounts. The names were clearly European, wealthy-sounding surnames preceded by titles and locations. The amounts were staggering, sums that would buy entire ranches or small towns. "What am I looking at?" Elijah asked, though a cold dread was already forming in his stomach. "Purchase orders," Jonas said quietly. "Contracts for the acquisition and delivery of children to wealthy European families who couldn't have children of their own, or who had specific requirements for the children they wanted to adopt." Elijah's blood turned to ice as the implications sank in. "You're saying they were selling children?" "I'm saying the Blackwood Trading Company has been running a kidnapping operation for over 30 years. They target isolated families in remote areas. Trappers, miners, homesteaders who live far from any law enforcement. They take the children and transport them east, then ship them across the Atlantic to buyers who pay handsomely for healthy American children." The ledger trembled in Elijah's hands as he read the entries more carefully. Each line represented a child's life reduced to a commercial transaction. Ages ranged from infants to 12 years old. The prices varied based on appearance, health, and what was coldly listed as breeding potential. "Sarah's name," he whispered. "Is Sarah's name in here?" Jonas nodded grimly and turned several pages. There, in neat black ink, was an entry that stopped Elijah's heart. "Sarah Rourke, age 8, blonde hair, blue eyes, healthy constitution. Acquired 11/15/1845. Payment $2,000. Destination: Lord Pemberton Estate, Yorkshire, England." Elijah stared at the entry until the words blurred. £2,000. His daughter's entire life had been worth £2,000 to these monsters. "How do you know this?" he managed to ask. "How do you have their ledger?" Jonas closed the book gently and set it aside. Because I used to work for them. For 15 years, I was Blackwood's best scout. I identified targets, planned the operations, and yes, I took the children. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Elijah felt his world tilting again. Reality reshaping itself around truths too horrible to fully comprehend. You took my daughter. I did, along with 16 others over the years. Jonas moved to the fireplace and stared into the flames. I told myself I was just following orders, that someone else would do the job if I didn't. I told myself the children were going to better lives with wealthy families who could provide for them. I told myself a lot of lies to sleep at night. Why? The word came out broken, barely audible. Why are you telling me this now? Jonas reached up and touched one of the items on the mantelpiece, a small wooden toy that looked like it had been carved with love. Because 15 years ago, I took a little girl from a cabin down in Colorado Territory. She was maybe 6 years old, with red hair and the brightest laugh you ever heard. Her name was Emma. He turned back to face Elijah, and there were tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. I delivered her to the Blackwood post as ordered, watched them load her into a wagon, bound for the railroad. But that night, lying in my bedroll, I heard her crying for her mama. Really heard it maybe for the first time. And I realized what I'd become. So you stopped? I tried to. But Blackwood doesn't let people walk away from an operation like this. They told me I knew too much, that I was either with them or against them. When I insisted I was done, they made it clear that my silence was worth more than my service. Jonas moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. They tried to kill me 3 times before I disappeared into these mountains for good. But I took their ledger when I fled. Every transaction, every name, every destination. Evidence of their crimes going back decades. Elijah looked again at the items on the mantelpiece, understanding dawning with sick clarity. These belong to the children you took. I kept something from each one. Told myself it was to remember them, to honor their memory somehow. But really, it was evidence. Proof of what had been done to them. Jonas's voice dropped to a whisper. I've been carrying that guilt for 16 years now. Living with the knowledge that 17 families were destroyed because of what I did. 17 families, Elijah repeated numbly. 17 sets of parents who never knew what happened to their children. 17 fathers like you, searching for answers they'd never find. Jonas turned back to him with eyes full of ancient pain. Until now. The old man moved to another trunk and withdrew a map, spreading it across the rough wooden table. It showed the territory in remarkable detail, with locations marked in red ink, scattered across hundreds of miles. These are all the places where children were taken, Jonas explained. And this, he pointed to a location far to the east, where the mountains gave way to rolling plains, is where the Blackwood Trading Company has their main operation. A ranch that serves as a collection point before the children are transported to ships on the coast. Elijah stared at the map, his mind struggling to process everything he'd learned. You're saying Sarah might still be alive? After 20 years? I'm saying that if she survived the journey to England, she's now a 28-year-old woman living somewhere in Yorkshire. She probably doesn't even remember her real name. For 20 years, Elijah had imagined his daughter dead, had tortured himself with visions of her final moments in some mountain wilderness. The possibility that she was alive, living across an ocean with people who'd stolen her childhood, was almost more than his heart could bear. Why tell me this now? He asked again. Why not years ago? Jonas Grimm looked older than his years as he answered. Because 2 months ago, I learned that Blackwood is planning to shut down their operation. Drew much attention from territorial authorities, too many questions being asked. They're eliminating evidence, if you take my meaning. The implication was clear, and it chilled Elijah to the bone. They're killing people who know too much. Anyone who could connect them to the missing children. Former employees, witnesses, even some of the families who've been asking too many questions. Jonas met his eyes. They're coming for me soon, and when they do, the truth dies with me, unless we stop them first. Jonas nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the map spread between them. Stop them, yes. But it won't be simple and it won't be clean. These aren't common outlaws we're talking about. Blackwood has money, connections, and men who know how to make problems disappear permanently. Elijah studied the red marks scattered across the territory, each one representing a family torn apart, a child stolen from everything they'd ever known. 20 years of rage had crystallized into something harder and colder than mountain ice. Tell me about their operation. How many men? What kind of defenses? At the ranch, maybe 15 to 20 men at any given time. All of them experienced fighters, most with military backgrounds. Blackwood pays well enough to attract that caliber of professional. Jonas traced a route on the map with one gnarled finger. The facility is built like a fortress. High walls, guard towers, only one way in or out that doesn't involve scaling cliffs. You've been there recently? Not in 15 years, but I've had my sources. Trappers, traders, even some of Blackwood's own men who developed consciences over the years. Jonas pulled another item from his trunk, a detailed sketch of a walled compound nestled in a valley between two ridges. The children are held in a central building before transport. The ledgers and records are kept in Blackwood's private office in the main house. Elijah examined the sketch with a tracker's eye for detail. The compound was indeed formidable, positioned to control the only practical approach through the valley. Any direct assault would be suicide for anything less than a full military unit. There's something else you need to know, Jonas continued, his voice growing heavier. About why I sent the wolf to find you specifically. The wolf didn't just wander to my cabin. That wolf was raised here from a pup. I found him half dead in a trap 16 years ago and nursed him back to health. He's been my only companion in these mountains ever since. Jonas's weathered face softened with genuine affection. Smart as any dog and loyal beyond measure. When I realized my time was running short, I knew I needed to get word to someone who might act on what I knew. But why me? There were other parents, other families, because you never stopped looking. In 30 years of watching these mountains, I've seen plenty of fathers give up after a few months or years. But not you. Every trapper, every prospector who passed through here had stories about Elijah Rourke, the mountain man who still searched for his lost daughter after 20 years. The old man's words stirred something painful in Elijah's chest. I had to keep looking. She was all I had left, and that's exactly why I chose you. A man who would search for 20 years wouldn't stop just because the trail led into danger. Jonas moved to the fireplace and picked up Sarah's yellow ribbon from the mantelpiece. I've carried this for 2 decades, along with the others. Reminders of what I helped destroy. Elijah took the ribbon with trembling hands. It was, indeed, Sarah's. He recognized the specific way the edges had been cut, slightly uneven, because Martha had let their 8-year-old daughter use the good scissors for the first time. Such a small thing to carry such enormous weight. How did the wolf know to find me specifically? I trained him over the years to recognize scents, to track specific individuals when necessary. Your scent was on this ribbon, faint but still there after all this time. Animals have ways of knowing things we don't understand. Jonas returned to the map, his finger finding a location roughly halfway between his cabin and Elijah's. 2 weeks ago, I sent him to your place with the red ribbon I'd made, copying the design from Sarah's yellow one. I wasn't sure you'd follow, but I hoped. You made that ribbon. Learned to sew and weave from necessity, living alone up here. The pattern wasn't hard to copy. Your daughter had a distinctive way of tying bows. Jonas's voice carried the weight of old regrets. I wanted you to have something that would compel you to follow the trail. Something that would bring you here to learn the truth. Elijah folded the yellow ribbon carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket alongside the red one. Having both pieces of his daughter's memory felt like holding fragments of her soul. What's your plan? You didn't bring me here just to confess your sins. No, I brought you here because I'm dying, and because you're the only man I trust to finish what needs to be done. Jonas's matter-of-fact tone made the words hit harder. Cancer, the kind that eats you from inside. I've got maybe 2 months before it takes me. Have you seen a doctor? Nearest doctor is 300 miles away, and there's nothing he could do anyway. I've made my peace with it. Jonas pulled out a chair and sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. But I can't die knowing that Blackwood is still out there, still destroying families. And I can't die knowing the evidence of their crimes dies with me. So we take that evidence to the territorial authorities. Jonas laughed bitterly. You think I haven't tried? 3 different marshals over the years, all of them bought and paid for by Blackwood. The company has enough money to corrupt anyone who might pose a threat to their operation. Then what do you propose? We take the operation down ourselves. Destroy their records, free any children they're currently holding, and make sure word gets out about what they've been doing. Jonas met Elijah's eyes with the intensity of a man running out of time. It won't bring back the children who are already gone, but it might save the ones they haven't taken yet. Elijah studied the sketch of the compound again, his mind automatically cataloguing the tactical challenges. 2 men against 15 or 20. Those aren't good odds. No, they're not. But we have advantages they don't expect. I know their routines, their weaknesses, their blind spots. And you, Jonas gestured toward him, you're a tracker who spent 20 years learning patience and precision. We're not going to charge the front gate like some dime novel heroes. What are you thinking? Jonas spread a larger, more detailed map across the table. This one showed not just the compound, but the surrounding terrain in careful topographical detail. Winter is the perfect time. Most of their men hole up in the bunkhouses after dark, and the guards get lazy in the cold. Snow muffles sound and covers tracks. How do we get inside? There's a service tunnel that runs under the east wall, used for waste disposal and accessing a natural spring. It's too narrow for most men, but we're both lean enough to make it through. Jonas traced the tunnel route with his finger. Gets us inside the compound without alerting the guards. And then we split up. You go for the holding building where they keep the children, if there are any currently there. I go for Blackwood's office to get the ledgers and any other evidence. We set fires to cover our tracks and meet at the extraction point. Elijah nodded slowly, seeing the logic in the plan even as he recognized its flaws. What if we're caught? Then we probably die. But at least we die trying to do something right for once. Jonas's eyes held no fear, only a kind of weary determination. I've been dead for 16 years anyway, ever since the night I heard little Emma crying. This would just make it official. The weight of the decision pressed down on Elijah like a physical force. Everything logical told him to walk away, to take what he'd learned, and try to find another way. But 20 years of searching, 20 years of wondering, 20 years of grief-fueled anger had led him to this moment. When do we leave? He asked. Tomorrow night, Jonas replied without hesitation. The weather's supposed to turn bad again, which works in our favor. Storm cover will mask our approach and keep their guards focused on staying warm instead of watching for intruders. Elijah spent the rest of that evening studying every detail of the compound layout while Jonas prepared supplies for their mission. The old hermit moved with surprising efficiency despite his age and illness, selecting weapons, tools, and equipment with the precision of someone who had planned dangerous operations before. This brings back memories, Jonas muttered as he cleaned an old Sharps rifle. Not good ones, but memories all the same. Military service, Army scout during the Mexican War, then some work for the government that I'd rather not discuss. Jonas set the rifle aside and picked up a pair of Colt revolvers, checking the action on each cylinder. That's how Blackwood found me in the first place. They recruited men with certain skills, men who could handle the darker aspects of their business, aspects like kidnapping children. Among other things, the child trafficking was just one part of their operation. They also ran guns to hostile tribes, smuggled contraband across territorial lines, eliminated competition through intimidation and violence. Jonas's voice carried the weight of old shame. I told myself I was just taking assignments, earning money to build a new life somewhere clean. But the truth is, I was a criminal working for criminals. Elijah watched the older man work, seeing the careful, methodical movements of someone accustomed to preparing for violence. Despite everything Jonas had confessed, despite the terrible crimes he'd participated in, there was something about him that inspired a grudging respect. Whatever else he'd been, he'd chosen to face his sins rather than carry them to the grave. "Tell me about the children currently at the compound," Elijah said. "Do you know how many there are?" Jonas paused in his weapon maintenance. "Last intelligence I received suggested 3, maybe 4. 2 boys and at least 1 girl, all taken within the past few months from settlements along the Oregon Trail. Ages: young. The buyers prefer children under 10, easier to adapt to new circumstances, less likely to retain clear memories of their original families." Jonas's jaw tightened. "There's supposed to be a shipment heading east within the next week, which means time is running short for those children." The thought of youngsters trapped in that compound, probably terrified and crying for parents who didn't even know they were alive, stirred the rage that had been building in Elijah's chest for 2 decades. Those children were facing the same fate that had befallen Sarah, the same nightmare that had destroyed his family and countless others. What about Blackwood himself? Will he be there? Charles Blackwood rarely visits the ranch personally. He prefers to run things from his headquarters in Denver, staying far enough removed to maintain plausible deniability. Jonas loaded ammunition into a leather cartridge belt. But his lieutenant, a man named Kruger, is usually on site. He's the one who oversees day-to-day operations. What kind of man is Kruger? The worst kind. Former Prussian military officer, fought in European wars before coming to America. Efficient, ruthless, and completely without conscience. Jonas met Elijah's eyes. "If we encounter him, don't try to take him alive. He won't extend the same courtesy to us." As night deepened around the cabin, Jonas pulled out one final item from his collection, a small leather journal filled with handwritten notes. "Guard schedules, supply deliveries, personnel rotations, everything I've been able to learn about their current operations." Elijah studied the information by lamplight, committing details to memory. The compound followed predictable patterns, which was both helpful and dangerous. Helpful because it meant they could plan around known routines. Dangerous because any deviation from those routines could indicate they'd been discovered. "The children's building is here," Jonas pointed to the sketch. "Single story, barred windows, one entrance that's usually guarded. The guard changes every 4 hours. And there's typically a 15-minute gap during shift changes when the position is unmanned. 15 minutes isn't much time. It'll have to be enough." The building layout is simple. One main room where the children sleep, a smaller room for the guard when he's inside, and a storage area for supplies. "If there are children there, they'll be in the main room." Elijah traced the path from the service tunnel to the children's building with his finger. "Roughly 200 yards across open ground. Even in a storm, that's exposed territory. There are some outbuildings that provide cover for most of the route. Stables, tool sheds, storage barns. We'll need to move carefully, but it's doable." Jonas closed the journal and looked at Elijah seriously. "There's something else you need to understand about this mission. Even if we succeed, even if we rescue those children and destroy Blackwood's evidence, it won't bring Sarah back." The words hit like a physical blow. But Elijah had already wrestled with that reality during the long hours of planning. "I know, but it might prevent other fathers from losing their daughters, and that's enough for you." Knowing that Sarah is probably living in England with no memory of her real family, no knowledge of the father who never stopped searching for her. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire and thinking about the little girl who used to sit on his lap while he whittled wooden horses. "I've spent 20 years hoping she was alive somewhere, praying that whoever took her was at least treating her kindly. If she's safe and happy, even if she doesn't remember me, then maybe that's enough." "You're a better man than I am, Elijah Rourke." "No, I'm just a father who's finally learned the difference between vengeance and justice." Jonas nodded slowly and began gathering the weapons and supplies into travel packs. "We'll leave before dawn, approach the compound from the north, where the terrain provides the best concealment. The service tunnel entrance is about a mile from the main gate, hidden among some rock formations." "How long to reach the compound?" Full day's travel if we push hard. We'll want to be in position by sunset tomorrow, then wait for full darkness before making our move. As they prepared for sleep, Elijah found himself thinking about Martha, wondering if she was still alive somewhere, still grieving for the daughter they'd lost. Would she approve of what he was planning to do? Would she understand that sometimes a man had to risk everything to save children he'd never met, simply because no one else would? "Jonas," he said quietly into the darkness. "That wolf of yours, what was his name?" "Ghost. I called him Ghost because he could move through these mountains without leaving a trace." "Ghost," Elijah repeated, thinking about the ancient creature that had carried impossible memories to his door. He knew, didn't he? He knew what bringing me that ribbon would lead to. "Animals understand things we don't," Jonas replied. Maybe he understood that some debts can only be paid in blood. Outside the cabin, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of the storm that would cover their approach to the Blackwood compound. Elijah closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind was filled with images of frightened children waiting for rescue, and the spectre of a daughter he would probably never see again. Tomorrow night, 20 years of searching would finally lead him to the truth, whatever that truth might cost him. They left before dawn, moving through the pre-storm darkness like shadows among shadows. Jonas moved with surprising agility for his age, leading them through hidden passes and forgotten trails that bore no trace of recent human passage. The old hermit knew this country with an intimacy that came from decades of careful observation. As they traveled, Elijah found himself studying his unlikely companion with new eyes. Whatever Jonas Grimm had been in his darker days, he was clearly a man of considerable skills. He read the terrain like a book, anticipated weather changes hours before they manifested, and moved through the wilderness with the fluid efficiency of someone born to it. "Storms coming faster than expected," Jonas observed as they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley. "We'll reach the compound by mid-afternoon instead of evening. Is that good or bad?" "Depends on what we find when we get there." Jonas pulled out his field glasses and studied the distant landscape. See that smoke column about 10 miles northeast? That's the compound." Elijah took the glasses and focused on the thin line of smoke rising against the grey sky. It looked innocent enough, just another ranch or trading post nestled in the wilderness. But knowing what horrors took place behind those walls transformed the peaceful scene into something sinister. They pushed hard through the morning, covering ground at a pace that left Elijah's aging joints aching despite years of mountain conditioning. Jonas seemed driven by an urgency that went beyond their mission timeline. Glancing frequently at the darkening sky and checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency. "You're worried about something," Elijah observed during a brief rest stop. Intelligence reports suggested the next shipment wouldn't leave for several days, but smoke patterns and other signs suggest increased activity at the compound. Jonas's weathered face was grim. "I'm concerned they may have moved up their schedule, meaning the children could be gone already. Or worse, if Blackwood suspects his operation has been compromised, he might decide to eliminate evidence entirely." The implication hung between them like a physical weight. They pushed on without further rest, driven now by the possibility that every minute's delay might cost innocent lives. It was mid-afternoon when they reached the observation point Jonas had selected, a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the Blackwood compound, while remaining concealed from the guards below. What they saw through the field glasses made Elijah's blood run cold. The compound was indeed bustling with activity, but not the routine operations Jonas had described. Armed men moved with military precision between buildings, loading supplies into wagons with urgent efficiency. Guard posts that should have held single sentries were doubled, and the main gate was reinforced with additional barriers. "They know," Jonas breathed, lowering the glasses. "Somehow they know we're coming. How is that possible?" Before Jonas could answer, a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Both men dropped instinctively, scanning the ridge lines for signs of hostile activity. That's when Elijah saw them. At least a dozen armed men moving through the rocks above their position, systematically searching every possible hiding place. "Trap," Jonas said simply. This whole thing was a trap. They scrambled down from the observation point, seeking cover among the larger boulders, while armed men closed in from multiple directions. But even as they moved, Elijah's mind was racing through the implications. If Blackwood had known they were coming, if this was all an elaborate setup, then everything Jonas had told him was suspect. "The ledger," Elijah said, as they pressed themselves against a massive stone formation. "The confession about taking children. How do I know any of it was true?" Jonas met his eyes with an expression of infinite sadness. "Because, my friend, the truth is more complicated than even I told you." "What do you mean?" "I mean that yes, I worked for Blackwood. Yes, I participated in taking children from their families. But I wasn't just following orders like some mindless soldier." Jonas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I was Charles Blackwood's partner in the operation from the very beginning. Half of everything they made belonged to me." The revelation hit Elijah like a physical blow. "You're saying you weren't just an employee? I was one of the architects of the entire child trafficking network. The mountain hermit story, the guilt-ridden confessor seeking redemption. It was all carefully crafted to gain your trust." Jonas pulled out his revolver and checked the cylinder. "Blackwood doesn't know about my change of heart. Doesn't know I've been documenting his operations. As far as he's concerned, I'm still his partner, and you're a threat that needs to be eliminated. But why? Why bring me here if you're still working with them?" "Because I wasn't lying about the cancer. I wasn't lying about wanting to stop the operation before I die. But I needed someone to help me do it. Someone with the skills and motivation to see it through." Jonas looked older than his years as he continued. "The problem is, Blackwood has spies everywhere. Someone must have reported that I'd made contact with you." More rifle shots echoed through the valley, closer now. The armed men were systematically searching every hiding place, moving with the patient thoroughness of professional hunters. "The ribbon," Elijah said suddenly. "Sarah's ribbon. You really did take her?" "I took her, yes. But not the way you think." Jonas leaned around the boulder and fired a quick shot at a figure moving through the rocks above them. "Your daughter wasn't sold to English aristocrats like the others. She was kept at the compound, raised there as part of the operation." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Sarah never left these mountains. She grew up at the Blackwood Ranch, trained from childhood to help with their operations. She's 28 years old now, and she's one of their most effective agents." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elijah's feet. "That's impossible. Children are resilient, especially when they're young enough. Sarah adapted, forgot her old life, embraced the new one. Blackwood told her that her real parents had abandoned her, that he'd rescued her from certain death in the wilderness." Jonas fired another shot, then ducked back into cover as return fire sparked off the rocks around them. "She believes he saved her life. You're lying." "I wish I were. But your daughter is probably down there right now, helping to coordinate the search for us. She goes by the name Catherine Blackwood now. Blackwood adopted her legally years ago." Elijah felt something breaking inside his chest, some fundamental belief about the nature of justice and redemption. "All these years she's been alive. All these years I could have found her. And what would you have found? A woman who considers you a stranger, who would fight to protect the man who stole her from you." Jonas's voice was gentle but merciless. "Sometimes the truth is worse than ignorance." "Elijah," the sound of approaching footsteps forced them to move again, scrambling across loose scree toward a narrow canyon that might offer better defensive positions. But even as they ran, Elijah's mind was reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. "Why, tell me this now," he gasped as they reached the canyon mouth. "Because if we somehow survive this, if we somehow manage to complete our mission, you need to understand what you'll be facing. Sarah, Catherine, won't thank you for destroying Blackwood's operation. She'll see you as an enemy who ruined her life. But if I can make her understand, if I can help her remember, 20 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight." And even if they did, even if she remembered being your little girl, how do you think she'll feel knowing she spent 2 decades helping to steal children from families like yours? The pursuing gunmen had reached the canyon entrance, their voices echoing off the stone walls as they organized for a final assault. Jonas checked his ammunition and gave Elijah a look that was equal parts apology and determination. "I'm sorry I brought you into this," he said. "But I couldn't die knowing that operation would continue unchallenged. Even if we fail, even if this is the end, at least we tried to do something right." Elijah gripped his own weapon and thought about the little girl who used to tie yellow ribbons in her hair, who was now a woman he wouldn't recognize, and who wouldn't recognize him. "What's the plan?" "We fight our way to the compound. We complete the mission. And we pray that somehow in the end it makes a difference." The first of the gunmen appeared around the canyon wall, and the shooting began in earnest. The narrow canyon became a killing ground within moments, echoing with the sharp crack of rifle fire and the whine of bullets ricocheting off stone walls. Elijah pressed himself against the canyon wall, drawing on 20 years of hunting experience to make every shot count. Beside him, Jonas moved with the deadly efficiency of a professional soldier, his shots precise and economical. "There's too many of them," Elijah shouted over the gunfire. "They'll pin us down here and wait us out." "Then we don't give them the chance," Jonas replied, reloading his revolver with practiced speed. "See that ledge about halfway up the canyon wall? If we can reach it, we'll have better position and a way out through the rocks above. The climb would expose them to enemy fire for precious seconds, but staying in their current position meant certain death once the gunmen worked around to flank them." Elijah nodded grimly and began working his way toward the base of the cliff. Using every available scrap of cover, the ascent was a nightmare of loose rock and exposed movement. But somehow they both made it to the ledge without taking serious hits. From their new position, they could see the full extent of the force arrayed against them. At least 20 men spread throughout the canyon and surrounding ridges, all armed with military-grade weapons. Blackwood sent his entire security detail, Jonas observed, breathing heavily from the climb. "Either he really wants us dead, or there's something at the compound worth protecting with everything he has. The children, or evidence that could destroy his entire organization. The ledger I showed you was just one of several. If the territorial authorities ever got their hands on Blackwood's complete records, they could trace the trafficking network all the way back to its European connections. They moved along the ledge, using the elevation advantage to pick off pursuers while working toward the canyon's far end. But each shot revealed their position, drawing return fire that chipped away at their already limited cover. It was only a matter of time before superior numbers told. "We need to separate," Jonas said during a brief lull in the fighting. "I'll continue along this ledge, draw their attention. You work your way down and around, try to reach the compound from the south. That's suicide. They'll cut you down within minutes." "Probably, but it gives you a chance to complete the mission." Jonas handed Elijah a small leather pouch. "That contains the location of my cache, documents, evidence, everything needed to expose Blackwood's operation. Even if you can't rescue the children, getting that information to honest authorities might prevent future abductions." Elijah took the pouch reluctantly. "There has to be another way. 20 years ago, there might have been." "Now?" Jonas gestured at the armed men closing in from multiple directions. "Sometimes a man's last act is the most important thing he ever does. Make mine count for something." Before Elijah could protest further, Jonas stood and began firing rapidly down into the canyon, exposing himself completely to draw every enemy gun in his direction. The responding volley was immediate and devastating, but it also created exactly the distraction. Elijah needed to begin his descent down the far side of the canyon. The sound of gunfire faded behind him as he worked his way through a maze of rock, formations and sparse vegetation. Jonas's sacrifice had bought him precious time, but the old hermit's death weighed on his conscience like a physical burden. Another life lost to the endless cycle of violence that had begun with Sarah's abduction. 20 years ago, the approach to the compound from the south was treacherous, but unguarded. Blackwood had committed all available men to the canyon battle, leaving his rear flank exposed. Elijah covered the final mile in less than an hour, driven by a desperate urgency that overcame exhaustion and grief. From his concealed position in a cluster of boulders, he could see the compound clearly for the first time. The walls were higher than Jonas's sketches had indicated, topped with iron spikes and patrolled by guards at regular intervals. The main gate was reinforced and heavily defended, but the service tunnel entrance should be somewhere in the rock formation to his left. Finding the tunnel took longer than expected. Jonas's directions had been accurate, but 20 years of weather and erosion had changed the landscape considerably. When Elijah finally located the narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, his heart sank. The tunnel was partially collapsed, blocked by fallen stones and decades of accumulated debris. But as he examined the blockage more closely, he realized it might still be passable. The collapse had created a smaller opening, child-sized rather than adult-sized, but a determined man might squeeze through if he was willing to risk getting trapped underground. The crawl through the tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare that took nearly 30 minutes of careful progress, through spaces barely wide enough for his shoulders. Twice he had to stop and clear debris by hand, working in complete darkness while fighting the panic that came with tight spaces and limited air. But eventually he emerged into what appeared to be a basement storage area beneath one of the compound's outbuildings. The sounds of normal activity filtered down from above. Voices, footsteps, the routine noises of a functioning facility. But underlying those familiar sounds was something else that made Elijah's blood run cold. Children crying. Somewhere in this compound, young voices were calling for parents who would never come. He worked his way up from the basement through a series of storerooms and corridors, following the building plans Jonas had sketched from memory. The children's building was across a central courtyard, normally visible from multiple guard positions, but currently screened by late afternoon shadows and the growing storm. As he prepared to cross the open ground, Elijah caught sight of movement in one of the main building's windows. A woman's silhouette, tall and graceful, moving with confident authority through what appeared to be an office or conference room. Something about her posture, the way she held her head, stirred a memory so profound it nearly dropped him to his knees. Sarah, older, changed almost beyond recognition, but carrying herself with the same unconscious pride she'd shown as an 8-year-old girl who feared nothing and trusted everyone. Catherine Blackwood now, Jonas had said. A woman who considered her kidnapper a father and her real father a stranger. The sound of approaching footsteps forced him to abandon his surveillance and focus on the mission. 2 guards were making rounds, their route taking them directly past his hiding place. He waited until they passed, then sprinted across the courtyard to the children's building. The structure was exactly as Jonas had described, single-story, barred windows, one entrance currently guarded by a man who looked bored and cold. Elijah circled the building, looking for an alternative way inside, and found it in a loose board covering what had once been a window on the building's rear wall. The space beyond the board was dark and cramped, clearly designed as a storage area rather than living space. But voices filtered through the thin wall, separating this room from the main area where the children were kept. Young voices, speaking in the careful whispers of those who had learned that making noise brought punishment, said they might take us on a trip soon, one child was saying, a boy by the sound of it. But I don't want to go. I want to go home. There is no home anymore, replied another voice, older and more resigned. This is home now. The sooner you understand that, the easier it gets. Elijah worked carefully at the wall boards, finding a section weakened by age and moisture. He managed to create an opening just large enough to see through, giving him a view of the main room, where 4 children sat on rough wooden benches. 3 boys and 1 girl, all between 6 and 10 years old, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of young people who had seen too much suffering. They were clean and adequately clothed, but there was something about their posture, their careful movements, that spoke of harsh discipline and constant fear. These weren't children being prepared for loving homes. They were prisoners being conditioned for transportation like livestock. The girl looked up suddenly, her eyes meeting his through the small opening. For a moment she seemed about to cry out, but something in Elijah's expression must have reassured her. Instead, she moved closer to the wall and whispered, "Are you here to help us?" "Yes," he whispered back, "but I need you to stay quiet and be ready to move quickly when I tell you." "The guard will come back soon," the girl warned. "He checks on us every hour." Elijah glanced at his pocket watch. If the guard followed a regular schedule, he had maybe 20 minutes before the next inspection. 20 minutes to get 4 children out of a heavily defended compound and to safety. Even with Jonas's distraction in the canyon, the odds were impossibly long. But as he looked at those young faces, saw the desperate hope flickering in their eyes, Elijah knew he couldn't walk away. 20 years ago, he'd failed to protect his own daughter from monsters like Blackwood. Today, perhaps, he could save someone else's children from the same fate. The sound of boots approaching across the courtyard told him time had run out for planning. The guard was returning early, and Elijah was trapped in a storage room with no way out except through the children's area, directly into the arms of his enemies. The guard's footsteps stopped just outside the door to the children's room. Elijah pressed himself against the wall, his hand moving instinctively to his knife. Through the crack in the boards, he could see the children sitting in perfect stillness, their faces carefully blank in the way young people learned when any expression might bring punishment. The door opened with a rusty squeal, and a heavy-set man in a dirty wool coat stepped inside. His eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency, counting heads and checking for any signs of disturbance. "Anyone caused trouble while I was gone?" he asked in a voice that suggested he hoped the answer would be yes. "No, sir," the oldest boy replied carefully. "We've been quiet, just like you told us." "Good, keep it that way." The guard moved closer to where the children sat, his boots echoing loudly on the wooden floor. "Word is, we might be moving you little ones tomorrow instead of next week. So you better get your rest tonight. Long journey ahead." Elijah's blood chilled. If Blackwood was accelerating the shipment schedule, these children would disappear forever within hours. Whatever he was going to do, it had to be now. The guard turned to leave, but stopped when he noticed something near the wall where Elijah was hidden. "What's that?" he muttered, bending down to examine the loose board Elijah had displaced. There was no choice left. Elijah erupted through the weakened wall section in an explosion of splintering wood and dust. The guard spun toward the sound, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip, but Elijah was already moving. 20 years of mountain living had kept him strong and fast, and 20 years of suppressed rage gave his attack a fury that overwhelmed trained reflexes. The knife found its mark between the guard's ribs before the man could draw his weapon. They went down together, rolling across the floor in a deadly embrace that ended when Elijah's blade found the guard's heart. The man's eyes widened in surprise, then went dark as death claimed him. "Don't look," Elijah told the children as he wiped his blade clean. "Just gather anything you need to take with you. We're leaving right now." The youngest boy, maybe 6 years old, began to whimper. "We're not supposed to leave without permission. They'll be angry." "I'm giving you permission," Elijah said gently, kneeling to the boy's level. "My name is Elijah, and I'm here to take you home to your families." "You promise?" the little girl asked, her voice barely audible. "I promise. But we have to be very quiet and very brave. Can you do that for me?" All 4 children nodded solemnly. They had so little to gather, a few scraps of clothing, a wooden toy one boy clutched like a talisman, that they were ready to move within minutes. But getting them out of the compound alive would require more than determination. Elijah peered through the barred window at the courtyard beyond. Guards were visible at their posts along the walls, and lights were beginning to come on in the main buildings as evening approached. The storm Jonas had predicted was finally arriving, bringing with it wind and the first scattered snowflakes that might provide cover for their escape. "Listen carefully," he whispered to the children. "We're going to leave through the back wall, then move very quietly through the rocks behind this building. Stay close together, do exactly what I tell you, and don't make any noise no matter what you see or hear. Understand?" They nodded again, their young faces set with a determination that broke Elijah's heart. Children shouldn't have to be this brave, shouldn't have to risk their lives just to reach the safety that should have been their birthright. The wall section he'd damaged provided an adequate exit route, though getting 4 children through the opening required careful assistance. One by one, he helped them squeeze through the gap and into the narrow space between the children's building and the compound's outer wall. The rocks Jonas had mentioned provided decent concealment, but moving 4 young people through difficult terrain while avoiding detection would have been challenging under the best circumstances. With armed guards patrolling the area and a storm beginning to reduce visibility, it was nearly impossible. They'd made it maybe 50 yards when the alarm bell began to ring. Someone had discovered the dead guard, and the entire compound erupted into activity. Shouts echoed across the courtyard as armed men poured out of the buildings, torches and lanterns creating dancing pools of light in the growing darkness. Search parties began forming with military efficiency, each one assigned to specific sectors of the surrounding terrain. "They'll find us," the oldest boy whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Not if we keep moving," Elijah replied, though he knew their chances had just dropped to almost nothing. "Follow me, stay low, and remember, no noise no matter what happens." Behind them he could hear orders being barked in multiple languages. Blackwood's men were professionals, and they knew their business. It would only be a matter of minutes before the search pattern reached their hiding place among the rocks. But as Elijah led the children deeper into the darkness, he caught sight of something that made his heart skip. A tall figure was moving through the compound with calm authority, coordinating the search teams and directing their deployment. Even at this distance, even in the uncertain light of torches and storm, he recognized the way she carried herself. Sarah, his daughter, now grown into a woman who was hunting him through the night. The little girl he'd spent 20 years searching for was now his enemy, determined to stop him from saving 4 children who faced the same fate she'd endured decades ago. The bitter irony nearly broke his resolve. The search teams were closing in with methodical precision, their torches cutting through the darkness like accusatory fingers. Elijah crouched behind a boulder with the 4 children pressed against him, feeling their small bodies trembling with cold and fear. The youngest boy was fighting back sobs, and the girl kept looking back toward the compound with the hollow resignation of someone who expected to be dragged back to captivity. "There's movement in the rocks," a voice called from somewhere too close. "Sector 7, about 100 yards from the east wall." Elijah heard the distinctive sound of rifle bolts being worked, metal sliding against metal with deadly purpose. He had perhaps 60 seconds before the search teams reached their position, and the terrain ahead offered little concealment. Behind them, the compound's lights created a barrier of illumination impossible to cross unseen. That's when he heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist in this place at this time. The long, mournful howl of a wolf echoing across the valley from somewhere in the northern darkness. But this wasn't just any wolf call. It was the specific pattern Jonas had taught him years ago, a signal used by mountain men to communicate across long distances. Ghost, somehow. Jonas's wolf had survived and followed their trail to the compound. The howl came again, closer now, and was answered by others. A pack was gathering in the darkness beyond the compound walls, their voices weaving together in a chorus that spoke of wild things reclaiming territory, stolen by civilized men. "Wolves," one of the guards muttered nervously. "I haven't heard them this close to the compound in years." "Keep searching," came the reply in a woman's voice that cut through Elijah like a blade. Sarah's voice, older and harder than the child he remembered, but unmistakably hers. "Animals don't ring alarm bells. We're looking for men." She was closer now, maybe 30 yards away, directing the search with cool efficiency. In the dancing torchlight, Elijah caught glimpses of her profile. The same determined set to her jaw, he remembered. The same way of holding her head when concentrating on a problem. His daughter, grown into a woman who served the monsters who had stolen her childhood. The wolf calls grew louder and more numerous, creating a symphony of wildness that seemed to unnerve even Blackwood's hardened men. And in that moment of distraction, Elijah saw his chance. "When I move, follow me exactly," he whispered to the children. "Don't think, just run." He led them in a desperate sprint across open ground, using the chaos of multiple search teams and the distraction of the wolf pack to mask their movement. Behind them, shouts erupted as someone spotted their fleeing figures. But they'd gained precious seconds of head start. The terrain ahead dropped into a steep ravine that would provide cover but also trap them if the pursuers reached the rim before they could climb out the other side. Elijah half-carried, half-dragged the smallest children down the rocky slope, their feet slipping on loose stone and frozen ground. "This way," Zara's voice rang out above the confusion. "They're heading for the North Ravine." She'd anticipated his route, cut off his escape before he even reached it. Torches appeared along the ravine's rim like fallen stars, and rifle muzzles pointed down into the darkness where 4 children huddled against the cold stone. "Elijah Rourke," Sarah called down into the ravine, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "That's your name, isn't it? The mountain man who's been hunting for his lost daughter?" Elijah stepped into the open, shielding the children behind him with his body. In the torchlight from above, he could see her clearly for the first time. Tall, strong, beautiful, in the way mountain women became when hardship burned away everything soft, but left them unbroken. She held a rifle with practiced ease, its barrel trained on the center of his chest. "Sarah," he called back, his voice rough with 20 years of grief. "My name is Catherine Blackwood. Sarah Rourke died in these mountains 20 years ago." Her voice carried no warmth, no recognition, just the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to eliminating problems. "You should have left her buried. I'm your father. Charles Blackwood is my father. He saved me from men like you, drifters and criminals who would have left a child to die in the wilderness." The rifle never wavered. "Send the children up, and I might let you walk away from here." Behind him, Elijah heard the little girl whisper, "Don't let them take us back. Please." He thought of Jonas, dying in the canyon to give them this chance. He thought of 17 families destroyed by the Blackwood operation, of children sold like livestock to buyers who saw them as property. He thought of the little girl who used to tie yellow ribbons in her hair, now grown into a woman who protected the same monsters who had stolen her innocence. "No," he said simply. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that moment the wolf pack struck. They came out of the darkness like grey ghosts, flowing over the ravine's rim with deadly silence. Ghost led them, ancient and scarred but still magnificent, his yellow eyes reflecting the torchlight as he leaped at the nearest gunman. The other wolves followed, attacking with the coordinated precision of predators who had claimed this territory as their own. Chaos erupted above as men screamed and fired wildly into the darkness. Torches fell, creating scattered pools of fire that illuminated scenes of primal violence. In the confusion, Elijah grabbed the children and ran. The chaos of the wolf attack provided the distraction Elijah needed to get the children clear of the compound, but their escape was far from assured. Behind them, gunfire continued sporadically as Blackwood's men tried to drive off the pack, while ahead lay miles of treacherous mountain terrain that would challenge even experienced adults. The 4 children stayed close as they climbed out of the ravine and into the forest beyond. The youngest boy was flagging badly, his small legs struggling with the pace Elijah knew they had to maintain. Without hesitation, he scooped the child up and carried him, pushing through exhaustion and the burning pain in his aging joints. "Where are we going?" the oldest girl asked as they paused to rest beside a frozen stream. "There's a cabin about 10 miles north of here," Elijah replied, though he wasn't certain they could cover that distance before hypothermia or pursuit claimed them. "A friend of mine keeps supplies there for emergencies." It wasn't entirely true. The cabin belonged to a trapper he'd known years ago, and he couldn't be sure it was still maintained. But the children needed hope more than harsh realities right now. They pushed through the night, following game trails and natural corridors that Elijah hoped would mask their passage. The storm that had been threatening finally arrived in earnest, bringing wind and snow that covered their tracks, but also made travel increasingly dangerous. More than once they had to shelter among rocks or dense trees while the worst of the weather passed. Dawn found them exhausted and half-frozen, huddled in the ruins of an old prospector's camp. The youngest boy was developing the glassy-eyed look that preceded serious frostbite, and all 4 children were moving with the mechanical persistence that came. Just before complete collapse, that's when Elijah heard the sound of approaching horses. He positioned the children behind a fallen log and readied his rifle, certain that Blackwood's men had finally caught up with them. But the riders who emerged from the tree line weren't wearing the rough clothing of compound guards. Instead, they wore the blue uniforms of territorial marshals, and the man in the lead carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Elijah Rourke. The lead marshal called out, "My name is Deputy Marshal William Hayes. We're here to help." Elijah kept his rifle trained on the approaching riders, 20 years of disappointment making him cautious of men who claimed to represent justice. "How do I know you're really marshals? How do I know you're not working for Blackwood?" Marshal Hayes dismounted slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Because Jonas Grimm sent us a package 3 weeks ago. Documents, evidence, everything we needed to finally move against the Blackwood operation." He pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebags, including this. Inside the pouch was a letter written in Jonas's careful handwriting, explaining everything about the trafficking operation and Elijah's mission to rescue the children. But more than that, it contained detailed maps showing the location of Jonas's evidence cache, along with instructions for the marshals to coordinate their raid with Elijah's infiltration. "We've been watching the compound for days," Marshal Hayes explained as his men distributed blankets and hot coffee to the children. "When the shooting started last night, we moved in. The whole operation is finished. Blackwood himself is in custody, along with most of his people." "And Sarah?" Elijah asked, though he dreaded the answer. Catherine Blackwood surrendered when she realized the situation was hopeless. "She's alive, but—" Hayes paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase what came next. "She refuses to acknowledge any connection to her original identity. As far as she's concerned, Sarah Rourke died 20 years ago." The words hit like physical blows, but they weren't unexpected. Jonas had warned him that 20 years of conditioning wouldn't disappear overnight, if ever. The little girl he'd lost was truly gone, replaced by a woman who saw him as an enemy rather than the father who'd never stopped searching for her. Will she face charges? That's complicated. Technically, she was a victim who was conditioned from childhood to participate in the operation. But she did help coordinate activities that harmed other children. Marshal Hayes looked genuinely sympathetic. The territorial judge will have to sort that out. As they prepared to ride toward the nearest settlement, Elijah found himself walking beside the marshal. "The other children, the ones who were sold over the years, is there any way to find them?" Jonas's documents include shipping manifests and buyer information going back decades. "We'll do everything we can to trace the victims and reunite them with any surviving family members." Hayes glanced at the 4 rescued children riding with his deputies. "It won't be easy, and it won't bring back the lost years, but it's a start." 3 months later, Elijah stood in his cabin doorway, watching spring slowly reclaim the high country. The wooden horse still sat on his mantelpiece, but now it was accompanied by 4 letters, updates from the families whose children he'd helped rescue from the Blackwood compound. All 4 were recovering, slowly learning to trust again, and rebuilding connections with parents who had never stopped hoping. There had been no word from Sarah. She was serving a reduced sentence at the territorial prison, and the warden had reported that she still refused all visits from anyone claiming connection to her past life. The doctor said her memories might return in time, but they offered no guarantees. Elijah had made his peace with that uncertainty. His daughter was alive, and perhaps that was enough. Somewhere in the world, a woman named Catherine bore his blood and his stubborn determination, even if she could never acknowledge the father who had searched for her across 20 years of mountain solitude. The red ribbon and yellow ribbon lay side by side in his Bible, pressed between pages that spoke of redemption and forgiveness. Sometimes healing came through reunion, and sometimes it came through letting go. Either way, it came through choosing love over vengeance, hope over despair. Outside his window, Ghost sat watching the tree line with the patient attention of a creature at peace with his place in the world. The old wolf had survived the compound battle and found his way back to the mountains where he belonged. They were both aging guardians now, watching over a wilderness that held its secrets close, but sometimes, just sometimes, revealed them to those persistent enough to keep searching. In the distance, a child's laughter echoed across the valley, carried on wind that tasted of snow and possibility.